Good evening, everybody. It's wonderful to see you all here again today. Today's lesson, kind of like a few weeks ago, is going to focus less on grammar and more about some vocabulary. This time around, though, the vocabulary is going to be focused on reading names. So, it's pretty obvious that everyone has a name, and we should all know how to write and read other people's names. But it's a little bit different in Japanese compared to English. For example, in English, let's see, my pen is working. There we go. Wrong tool. Get back to the right size here. And let's write this out. When we think about names, we think about names in English, we think about names like Smith, and I'm talking about surnames here, I'm talking about last names. Smith, think about names like Taylor. These are common last names in English. And we know that in regards to their meanings, usually someone with the surname of Smith worked a job as a blacksmith, you know? Their family worked at that specific job. Family of blacksmiths. Or like Taylor, you know, that family of tailors. So pretty straightforward there. And we have other names like, say, Johnson, which very literally is son of John. Or something like Wilson, son of William. These are pretty straightforward, and even if it's not something that you think about, it's pretty easy to sort of discern exactly where these names come from and how to read them. However, in Japanese, it's a little different because, kind of like with vocabulary words in Japanese, it's not like names typically tend to be written like, say... Ooh, that was not supposed to be seen yet. Hide these layers. We have names like, say... If you have the name Tanaka, right? Very common Japanese last name. And we talked about this one a while ago, too. When you see this name written out in Japanese, it's not going to be written like this. It's going to be written out as Tanaka, right? And if we look at like other languages that use, like, say, the Latin alphabet, we might not be able to know exactly how they're pronounced, but we can have some kind of an idea there. However, if you know the Japanese alphabet, if you know katakana and hiragana, you won't necessarily know how to read these two individually. So, names aren't going to be as obvious in Japanese, and what I want to talk about today is sort of the difference between, or not the difference, but some more common things that we see in naming conventions in Japanese. Good evening, Ace. I hope you're doing well. We're just getting started on the lesson. And so, to start off on this topic, I want to take a look at some common terms that are used in fairly common Japanese surnames. So let's take a look at some kanji here. And these are going to be some rather common kanji. These, I believe we even talked about a couple weeks ago. I want to look at the following words here. If we take a look at the following kanji here, this is rice field. This is going to be center. And this is going to be village. And the reason why I'm working with these is because they're very simple in both their reading and their drawing. They're not hard to write out. They use very simple strokes. And to start this off, let's talk about the pronunciation here. Back when I did my first lesson on kanji, we talked about there being two sorts of ways we pronounce words here, or ways we pronounce kanji. There's the kunyomi, or the Japanese reading, and the onyomi, which is sort of the traditional Chinese reading. As we know, Japanese was borrowed from, or these characters were borrowed from the Chinese language, along with their readings, so the way we read them is different. Or the way they read them traditionally in Chinese and their current Japanese readings are two different things sometimes. Let's talk about how names apply in this idea here. So, for kunyomi, rice field is read out as ta. The onyomi for this is den. Here we have naka as the kunyomi reading. And village here is read as mura. And see, the onyomi readings here are chu. And this is read as son. So, what it is, right? When we use names here, more often than not, it's the kunyomi readings that get used for names. There are very few instances that I'll end up getting to where we do use the onyomi reading, but that'll be closer towards the other side of this lesson here. So, with these three kanji, we can make a variety of names. We can make names like, one sec. Sorry about that. We can make a variety of names. We can make a name like I said earlier, there's Tanaka, which uses rice field and center. And that means, if we say rice field and center, that means from the center of the rice field, or from the rice field center. So Tanaka is from the rice fields. And I want to take a look at all the possible combinations of these three kanji as pairs and see just exactly how this breaks down. And I'm going to apply a number to each of these, and you'll see what these numbers represent. Maybe you'll be able to guess on your own, but let's see. So, let me just list these again. We have ta, naka, and mura. These are the kanji that we'll be experimenting with. So we could use a name like that. Little mistake there. First one that we'll look at, and I want to go into the meaning of these names as well. So this is going to be Naka Mura. We have center and village. So what a name like Nakamura would mean, we know that this is middle, and this is village, and that's pretty straightforward. It means pretty much exactly what it says on the tin, from the middle village. In college, your Japanese teacher's name was Iwashita, right? So Iwashita, which I'll draw that here. I believe it would be like this, and then a name like Iwashita. We didn't talk about Iwa, but we talked about Shita, which Shita means below, and Iwa is boulder, so below the boulder, below the rock. That is what that would mean. It's very literal with the kanji here. Each of these pictographs have their own meaning attached to them. So something like this, rock and below, would mean under the rock. Nakamura means middle village. If we pick a name like we take, ooh, sorry, wrong order here. Let's move this to the side so I have the room for it. A name like this, center and rice field, we get Nakata, which means middle rice field. Which, as I said earlier, Tanaka means from the rice field or from the center of the rice field. But Nakata is different because this is representing the rice field in the center. Think that you have a series of different rice fields. This name would represent someone coming from that central rice field. Out of all the rice fields, they're from the one in the center. Not to be confused with Tanaka, which means that they come from inside a rice field, or that essentially their family worked in the rice fields regularly. So again, this is also pretty straightforward, middle rice field. We have a name like Tanaka, which we already covered, but just to write the number out there. This is Tanaka. So just swapping it around swaps the meaning, or changes up the meaning. And you can see this is pronounced as Ta, this is pronounced Naka, and this is pronounced Mura. And just by swapping around their placement, Nakamura, Naka, this is Naka Ta, and this is Ta Naka. So this is rice field, middle, or from the middle of the rice field, from the rice field. Very, very straightforward, these names. And again, just like I say with learning kanji all the time, it's all just a matter of understanding the pictograms and just understanding what they mean. So they might look foreign to you at first, but the more you look at them, the more you visualize them, the more you read them, the more it'll just sort of start to click. Or hopefully it does. So this is from the rice field. Let's take a look at some other examples here. So we have, this one's not as common. Let me separate this. 58 is, or 56 is a number we'll use here. This is going to be Ta. I think it's just interesting personally how just like swapping around the words that they use in this really just changes up the entire meaning of the name. And seeing sort of, if you couldn't tell already, what these numbers mean is how popular the last name is, at least according to 2011. So you could see names like Nakamura and Tanaka. These are more common than, say, something like Nakata, which is still popular at being the 122nd most popular last name, but these two are still very much more widely used. This one is sort of in the middle. This is Tamura. Or this would be Rice Field Village. Which, again, I don't think I really need to rewrite any of that. Village. Sorry, village. So Tamura being a village that produces a lot of rice, essentially. We have something like, this is going to be Mura. Murata. This, on the flip side, now that we've flipped the kanji around, would be village, rice field. So again, very straightforward. Ricefield Village would imply something like the village you came from was known for its rice fields, while Murata, on the other hand, would represent something more along the lines of you worked at the rice field in your village. And if anyone here knows more than I do, I did a bit of research, but a lot of the word names I tried searching up, I couldn't find too much on this. I think my interpretations are probably on the right track, but if anyone could correct me, I would be more than happy to accept those corrections. And then lastly, this one's kind of obscure. And we have Muranaka. Still the 1000th most popular last name in the country is not that bad. I've definitely seen lower numbers. Muranaka. And that's it. As long as you understand the meanings here, it's pretty consistent. Like, I showed different readings of kanji here, like how Naka, the alternate reading is Chu. Typically, you're not going to see that kanji in someone's name and read it out as Chu. At least for the most part. There, I believe, are like standardizations in the pronunciation of naming kanji, so that that kind of stuff doesn't happen. Dead Space. Oh, would that be Sekimura or Ishimura? I think Ishimura is what that would be. I've never played Dead Space though. And Muranaka? Oh, Ishimura, okay. Yeah, that's what I thought. So this would be village center. Oh yeah. So a mining ship, yeah. So essentially Stone Village. That makes sense for a mining ship. And this would be village center. So you could probably tell, right? Ishimura Village Center. Out of all the people in the village, not everyone's gonna be in the village center. So those who are probably like, I'd assume this was probably relegated to people either who lived in a specific area or maybe the people who lived in the center of the village were more important. But you can see that this number, this last name, isn't as common as any of these other ones. Even Nakata is still the 122nd most popular last name or most common last name, while Muranaka is all the way at 1064. So the reason why I use this is because these three kanji are very similar, or very straightforward, and it sort of gives you an idea on how Japanese naming conventions work. What I'm going to do now, what I want to go over, is essentially I want to talk about the 20 most common surnames, just so you guys can get an idea on sort of, A, more on how these naming conventions work, and B, sort of to see like the history of these names and see how maybe the reason why these names are so popular, how their names relate to the environment of the country. So we'll start. The order that I'm going to go in with this, actually, there's a specific order that I'm doing things in. It's not going to be from most popular to least popular, or least popular to most popular. I want to go over this in a way that sort of eases you into the difficulty of understanding the kanji, because there's some kanji here that's going to be complicated, and some that aren't. And the first one I'm going to start with is number 15, Yamaguchi. So, again, very simple kanji. You can see this kind of looks like a W and this is just a box. So what Yamaguchi is, Yama is Japanese for mountain. Guchi is Japanese for mouth or opening or entrance. So you could tell that this probably was a name reserved for the kind of people who lived near the base of a mountain or to live near the mountain pathways, people who were probably on a pathway that led up to a mountain. So that's Yamaguchi. The next one I want to talk about, again, is going to use the same kanji. I try to group these together a lot by their kanji as well. So we have, again, another mountain one. This one is Yama. and our good old friend rice field. So in this case here, mountain, this would be rice field. So this name probably is reserved for people who lived around a mountain and also lived by the rice field, sort of the rice fields by the mountain. So that gives you the name Yamada, which, knowing the geography of Japan, there are quite a few mountains there, and also a lot of, yeah, maybe a terraced field too. I know that sometimes some readings that I looked up here refer to this as mountain field, which also maybe like the fields around the mountain, like not necessarily by the base of it, but the fields that are sort of surround a mountain. So it makes sense why something like that would be number 12, so high up there in the common surnames. We have Yamada, and again, the last of the mountain ones we have, and this is probably going to throw some of you off if you've paid attention to some of my other lessons, but here we have Yama, and different from what we actually know before, we know this kanji from Nihon. We know that this is pronounced as Hon, as the onyomi, but like I said, these name kanji mainly use the kunyomi readings here. We didn't talk about the kunyomi reading, but the reading is Yama Moto, origin. So it means book, but we also know that it means origin, kind of like how Land of the Rising Sun, the sun's origin, is the literal translation for Nihon. So this is mountain, origin, or base of the mountain. I just think it's interesting to see like how many names, like how 3 of the top 20 names all have to relate to mountains, which you know that there's a bunch of mountains. It's a very mountainous region over there. Arthur, thank you for joining the classroom. Just in time. I guess any time is good to enter here. A lot of this is going to be just explanation and talking about sort of the readings of Japanese names. We've currently gone through 5 of the most common names. Talked about Yamaguchi, Yamada, Yamamoto, and previously, Tanaka was the number 4 most popular name in Japan, and Nakamura was the 8th most popular, or 8th most common, I should say. So we're about a quarter of the way there, just talking about some different examples of common Japanese names and sort of seeing why exactly they might have been as common as they were. So next, we have 18th most common one, 18, which is, again, a character that we've seen from our previous kanji lesson here, but again, read differently. This isn't going to be read as Moku this time, but rather Hi. Because we're going with the kunyomi reading this time, the traditional Japanese reading instead of the traditional Chinese reading. And this is Kimura. Actually, I'm going to underline it so we can see exactly how the kanji breaks apart. So Kimura means Ki, or Moku, that's tree. Mura, as we know, means village. So very simply put, it's a tree village. Probably a village that had a lot of forestry and trees in it. A village built inside the forest. Which, again, given Japan's geography, that makes sense that those existed and that they were common enough for it to be a common surname. That's Kimura. 17. We have... Yeah, you're right, the teacher from Azumanga Daioh, that's correct. The male teacher, I believe. This is above, or this is well, and this, we've talked about before, is above, which translates to Inoue. E is that symbol over there, Usually this is read as ue, but sometimes there are characters added before or after the reading of it. And again, a character like ue, I remember talking about this before as well, ue and shita have a lot of different possible readings. So that kind of thing gets tricky. You'd think sometimes it would just be iue, because, you know, we don't talk about the no usually. But in this case here, it's I noe. And I being well, like a well that you draw water from, and this being above. So essentially it just means above the well. This one I actually found a lot of translations for. A lot of the translations that I'm writing, a lot of the interpretations, are ones that I get from very, like... I'm gonna be honest, I feel like a lot of them just found the two translations and just copied their dictionary definitions down and didn't, like, try to come up with an interpretation. And, like, I know I'm just writing the words here, but I feel like you could come up with more of an interpretation than just English word, English word. Like, Tamura meaning that it's a village, that they came from a village, a foresty village, essentially, not just tree village, which was literally some of the definitions that I had found while doing my research. The next one, and this is where the kanji will start to get a little bit more complicated. So we'll start with the 16th most common one. And this is... Find this together. Add the kanji for pine, and a kanji for origin, which gives us matsu. Matsu is pine. Moto is origin. Matsumoto, or pine, or pine tree, origin. This could be interpreted as time to learn, yep, from the pine trees. I don't know enough about Japan's geography to know how common pine trees are, but given that this is a fairly common surname, I'm going to assume that there are a good amount of areas in Japan that have pine trees. That's pretty interesting to note. Like, just by reading this name, you could probably infer that pine trees are common enough in Japan for it to be such a popular surname. Page, let's go on. We have... This one's kind of complicated. This is sa. This one was pretty hard for me to find an interpretation of, so my interpretation might be pretty off here. And it also has an important character here. So just as a general note, this central character here in the name, this kanji that looks like this, what this means, essentially, is that you repeat the sound of the kanji that came before it. So if this is sa, this first character here is sa, Sasaki. Essentially, it sort of gives an emphasis on whatever kanji you're using before it. So, like if I were to use, say, we know that this means center. If I say this would mean like inside, like deep, 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 deep inside. And this would be read as naka-naka. So just as a note there, this doesn't mean anything on its own. It's sort of like an emphasizer. You're right, yeah, it can also be a marker for plurals as well. That is correct. The Sasaki, as this is emphasizing or being marking for plurals, this represents, the sa represents assistant, so it could represent in this case as plurals. Assistants. And this represents trees, or tree. So it can mean assistants of the trees. Sasaki. So, essentially, I assume that a name like this is meant for people that probably like lived in the forest and probably took care of the forestry. People who took care of maybe like the wildlife there. Arborists, maybe? And also this is number 13. Oh! Melchior! Thank you for the big raid, for the thank you. Thanks for all the Melchior dabs. We're currently in the middle of going over some Japanese names, talking about the etymology and talking about how to read. If you've never been in a stream of mine before, on Thursdays I always do these Japanese lesson streams, and today we're doing a lesson on Japanese names. So, we're about halfway through. Thank you everyone for following and joining the classroom. Let's talk about the next name. We're currently going through the 20 most common Japanese surnames and sort of talking about their meanings and probably why exactly they are the most common surnames. What was it about maybe the landscape of Japan that made it so that they were the common surnames of that time and leading into modern day. So 20, the 20th most common one, and I'm going in order of how easier they are to write as opposed to the order from least popular to most popular. So the 20th most common one is, let's draw this out here. Got this is she, and this is Mizu. Mizu is water, she is pure. So she, Mizu. So very simply, pure water. So this is probably like the kind of names that were reserved for families that lived around a lake, or like maybe around like sacred areas, places of worship that were generally seen as clean. So it's the 20th most common last name, which again is still a very big deal. Being in the top 20 of what, I'm not actually sure what Japan's population is, but it's a big number, and that represents probably closer to just people who live by the lakeside, people who live by like clean water areas. And also, I wrote this in my notes, this is not typically read as she, and out of all the examples that we've gone through so far, this is probably the first example where the common Japanese reading of a name isn't actually how we read it in a name. The next one, I actually don't have much of an explanation for this next name. This is what we call let's write this out here. We have that classic, that rice field. We have Yoshida. So this here, Yoshi means luck or fortune. Oh wait, the next one's what I don't have an idea of. This one is pretty simple. Fortune. And this is rice field. So the name Yoshida, very simply, just means the lucky rice fields. So I guess when people had a good harvest, people saw certain rice fields as more fortunate, more lucky rice fields. So having a name like Yoshida meant that your family probably lived in an area in a rice field that had consistently good harvest, consistently good yields. So, Yoshi? Yeah. Moving on. The next one. This is actually the second most common surname. And that surname is very Japanese sounding. I guess all of these are, but I think like this is one that you really think of, like one that comes to mind when you think of Japanese surnames. Thinking about Shenmue. I think that's the right game. I think I'm thinking the right thing. This is Suzuki. Correct. Suzuki. So, ki, as we talked about before, is the kanji for tree, while this is susu, or bell. So, very straightforward. Suzuki means bell tree. I could have probably... I probably could have done more research on this name specifically, but I don't know if bell tree is like a specific kind of tree, or if they like hung bells off the trees and like that was like a ceremonial thing. But that is what Suzuki means. Do you happen to know what Hazuki? Is there a punchline? Is that a pun that's going over my head right now? Hazuki? I do not, actually. What does Hazuki mean? Oh! I was close. I see. Oh, and that's interesting that in this case here, Suzu, then Ki, is that kanji, but for Hazuki, it's Zuki that is the second kanji. That's interesting. How, like, that kind of stuff happens with names, I think. Next one. This one's actually not that complicated, but it matched up with another last name that I wanted to talk about. This one here. You're right, I have been conditioned. Oh, Hadzuki. Yeah, the voiced Tsu. But I assume it's probably like... Hadzuki. I had to guess, right? Anyway. Next one. Very simple name, actually. So, the next one we're going to talk about is... I like this one because it's like the same symbol twice, but it's one kanji. This is the kanji for forest, and it's just Hayashi. So, someone who had this last name, probably just someone who lived in a very forested area. Welcome, Siren. It's fine. This is a pretty easy lesson to just jump in and out of, because all we're talking about is just name meanings and etymology and just the origin of some common Japanese names. To follow up on this one, Hayashi is just forest, while the 9th most common name, I think it's just interesting what happens with the lettering here. This is Obayashi. And that means small forest. So this probably means that someone came from a smaller, more wooded area as opposed to a bigger forest. And why I put these two together, obviously because they both use the same kanji for forest, that Hayashi. But if you notice, it's read as Hayashi here, but when used as a compound word, when you put together with another kanji, that Hayashi turns into Bayashi. For those of you who don't remember fully how to write out these characters, the Ha and Ba sound are very, 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 very closely related. If we wrote this out with characters, this would just be Ha, Ya, Shi. Meanwhile, Obayashi uses those same characters, ko, with that ko in the front, and then ha. A lot of times when you make those compound words, a good amount of consonant sounds get that sort of muddled sound when they're compounded together. So instead of Hayashi, it's Bayashi, which kind of happens like if you were to think about, like, say, covering your nose and trying to say that consonant out, that's sort of what you get. So we get Hayashi, Obayashi. That's usually how I think about those muddled sounds, that ha turning into ba or ta turning into da. It's like if you had a stuffy nose, that's sort of what that sound turns into. And I guess when they do those compound words, they sort of say it fast enough that it sort of gets muddled on its own. So like Kohayashi kind of doesn't flow as well as Kobayashi, I guess might be the idea there. So that probably gets into some deeper kind of linguistics that I am not certified to talk about. A lot of that is just my conjecture. Moving on. We're almost done. We have about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 more to go through. Next one. Now the kanji are going to get a little bit more complicated from the previous. Here we have Taka, which means high. And then we have, I'm actually going to be drawing these bigger because otherwise I might not be able to draw these clear enough for it to be discernible. See if it's written like this. I think I am able enough to do this. This is high, and this is bridge. So, someone who lived on a high bridge, that name is Takanashi. Takahashi, the third most common Japanese name. So, I'm not sure, I think this might be interesting because, like, high bridge, I'm just wondering, like, how common, like, bridges were in Japan for a name like Takahashi to be that common. Like, I wonder if it was, like, for people who just lived by the bridges, maybe even, like, just above some water, if that was considered enough, like, that surname would be common. But it is, as of 2011, the third most common surname in Japan. The next one we have here. I saw a couple of interpretations for this one. This one was pretty hard for me to like find a consistent meaning, but it is draw this out like this. This is wata, or fairy. And then we have nabe, or side. So this is watanabe, which means fairy side, but I've also seen it written out as, instead of fairy side, I think I've also seen it mentioned as border crossing. I couldn't find a specific consistent meaning behind this, and these two kanji had a lot of different meanings to them, but these are the ones that I saw the most. So this could either be interpreted as people who lived by the boats, or by people who sort of traveled a lot, crossed a lot of borders, and honestly, they're pretty similar in that idea. Like, if you were taking a lot of ferries, you were probably doing a lot of traveling, which meant that you were crossing through borders. So there is a bit of close meaning between the two. And I guess for people who are traveling a lot, Japan's not big, so the lines of the borders probably were pretty easy to cross through, so people who traveled a lot, probably people who were like traders, probably had that name Watanabe. Next. So these next four names are actually going to be a little bit different. As I mentioned before, each of these names here that we've gone through so far, with the exception of Shimizu, they all use what we call the kunyomi reading, or the Japanese reading. Like the character for Hai, this character. The Japanese reading for this, the traditional, or the reading that they came up with after taking the character from China, this is Taka. But the original Chinese reading is Ko. Think about what they call high school, it's Koko, high school. If you think about a word like I mentioned earlier, rice paddy is read as Ta as its Japanese reading, but the Chinese reading is Den. Or how center is Naka, but whenever it's using compound words, or the original Chinese reading, that's Chu. Think chunibyo, middle of school, or middle school. So chu. So, for all the names that we've looked at so far, they use these Japanese readings. But the next 4 names that I'm going to go through have a pretty interesting history that I thought was, like, really... It was notable because not only do they instead use these Chinese readings for them, but they were all connected. And not connected just because of the kanji that they used, but that kanji had a very specific meaning. Let's take a look at this. This name is... We'll start with the first one. We're going to start... This is actually going to go in descending order. 14. The 14th most popular name in Japan, to start this off, is... Draw this out here. Oh, my stroke order is wrong. I'm going to get reprimanded. There we go. Looks like this. Sai, and then looks like this. And I hate that I'm gonna have to draw this out 4 whole times. Looks like this. Kind of a complicated one to draw out. This is Saito. Thank you. Saito. And what this means. The Saito means the Sai is purification. And To is wisteria. So the reading of this name is Saito. However, it's weird because this To, the translation of wisteria, the kunyomi reading for this, and this is what really threw me off when I was studying, when I was doing my research on these names. Because also, there weren't many good resources on this that I could find, but I'm pretty sure the resources that I found were accurate enough, at the very least. The Japanese reading for this is Fuji, but the Chinese reading is... The onyomi reading for this is To. But what I've found researching this, those last names, those surnames that end with To, all have to do with a specific big family that I believe ruled Japan. I think the years that I found were said to be like from the 900s to the 1200s. But what this is not the meaning of the word, your wisteria. It is interpreted as followers of the Fujiwara clan. Thank you, Melchior, and thank you for the raid. Thank you for stopping by. I really appreciate it. So, the followers of the Fujiwara clan. And you'll see that the other names here, the next 3 names I'm going to go through, all follow a similar idea. Number 15, or not number 15, number 10. This is... Ah. And then again, I'm actually going to do this. Do not have the energy to draw this 3 more times. Ato. Oh. And this one actually makes sense when you think about the readings now. Ka is add or addition. While To, again, this is a representation of that Fujiwara clan, of members or people who worked with the Fujiwara clan. That's what I'm going to mark this as. And what this was, the history behind this name was that they were a sort of faction that was separate from them, but then essentially joined together with the Fujiwara clan back during that time period. So essentially it's the addition to the Fujiwara clan. And I would think that like it was kind of weird that one clan had so much power that 4 of the top 20 most common surnames all were involved but they all involve that same kanji, that to kanji, which means that there has to be some connection, and I guess it makes sense for a powerful clan to have had that kind of power. This leads us to number 6, which is Ito. So this is Ito. This was also a really weird one, and it was so specific that, again, it just makes sense with the context of the other names. So normally this kanji here, the I, we use nowadays to represent Italy, which, yeah, I don't think that Japan was really connected with the rest of the world that closely for Italy to be related to one of the top 10 most common Japanese surnames. But this symbol was also used for reference to a great shrine. I believe they called it the Ise Shrine. So, Ise Shrine. And Fujiwara. The only source that I could find on this name, like, reliably, said that it was a branch of the Fujiwara clan that existed around the Ise Shrine. So essentially, this big area, this important shrine, and the members of it that were followers of the Fujiwara clan. And that leads us to one more name. One last name. We've gone through 19 different names. The last name we're going to go to is the number 1 most common name in Japan, the most common surname, and that is... We've actually seen both of these characters already. Sa. Oh. The name Sato, as of 2011, was the most common surname in Japan. And what this means... We talked about what Sa means before. Sa, as in assistance, and To, as in a part of that Fujiwara clan. This is assistant. I think this is actually really, really, really interesting. Like, it really just goes to show how powerful this clan was. That, essentially, the history that I learned here was that this literally translates to Lieutenant of Fujiwara. And I think it's so tricky because they don't use the Fuji reading for this character here. They use the To reading, but it relates to this powerful clan here and how the most common surname are from people who wanted to support this clan, people who worked as officers, or just people who like vowed to this clan. So Sato, the most popular surname in Japan, represents people that worked for the Fujiwara family. And there you have it. Just some history, just some explanation on 20 of the most common surnames, and I talked about some others as well. They weren't as common, but they all use some very simple kanji. Now there's one last thing I'd like to talk about here. It was brought up. I asked about some name stuff on Twitter, and I actually thought this was pretty interesting. One more name that I want to talk about here has to do with the concept of homophones. So, for those of you who speak English, a homophone, as you may know, is when you have two words that have the exact same pronunciation, and Japan has no shortage of that. So, let's take the following name here. I'm gonna mark this again, 88. No, that's not 88. I can't read my own handwriting. This is 668. And what this is, again, you'll recognize this first kanji. Maybe, if you've been taking notes. You have taka, which again means I. Knights are in vogue right now, Akashi. So hi. And then here we have pear tree. Very simple name, pear tree. And this name might be a name that you've heard of before, the pronunciation at least, is Takanashi. Takanashi. So 668. This is the 668th most popular name in Japan. I think there's a good, I think the number was 20,000 people who had this last name. Maybe more, maybe less. I could be wrong, I don't have the page open up right now. So, this is the name Takanashi. Yes. I think that's her surname. I think that is Kiara's surname, or what's supposed to be her surname. So, there's an alternate reading for this. And this is, quite possibly, the dumbest thing I've ever seen. But I guess I can't fault them for their cleverness here. And this isn't even like a thing that was made up before. This was done by a royal family who wanted to give his 4 sons the same name, or the same surname, but different readings of it. So this name, because of how ridiculous it is, has fallen very out of flavor. The placement of this surname, 58,500. There are currently in Japan, I believe, ancient version of celebrities naming their kids, right? I believe when I looked at the list on the website, I think it was like myoji.net, I think it said that there were 90 people left with this surname. So it's definitely not ancient times anymore. This reading, so this is a character for small. This is a character for birds. My stroke order is wrong, please don't bully me. It's close enough, you can still tell that it's bird. Small, birds. And then we have play. And that looks like this. This is Takanashi. But if you were anyone who like studied Japanese and like understood had a familiarity with kanji, your first instinct would probably be to read this as kotori, because small bird is kotori. Kotori asobu. Asobu. I'm not sure if it would be asobu or asobi, but essentially it would be small birds playing. Kotori asobu. Now the thing is, even though it would read like this normally, small birds play is read as Takanashi because small birds can play when, let me write this out. Here we have this kanji. This kanji is actually read as Taka. 2, 4, and then we draw this out here. The kanji that we get is 2, 3, 4. This is the kanji for hawk. And then we have nashi, which this is typically read as mu or nai, but nashi is another possible reading for this. 1, 2, 3, 4. And this means nothing or without. So what we get here, Takanashi, the reason why this here, this 58,500th last name, the reason why this is read as Takanashi is because small birds can play outside when there aren't any hawks flying about. It is a very silly play on words here. And just like reading into that, looking up the reasons for why that is a possible reading was very mind-boggling. And it's like, I feel like the closest it's a name for smart people. It's like when you think about like in English, how there are some people who like want to name their kids something like David, but like they don't want to be plain, so then they just decide to name their kids like David. And like, you could do that. You could say David like that, but your kid would get made fun of relentlessly. Maya is actually pretty interesting because so another Hololive name. If you guys follow Hololive, I'm sure a lot of you guys do. Nina's surname, Ninomai. Some of you already probably know this already. So, how this would be written out. Ninomai. Ni is 2. No. I think I'm writing this correctly. Mai. So, what this would translate to literally, Mae is front. Ni. Yeah, you're right. You're right, Reina. And the no is possession, so front of 2. Do a front. We'll just swap this around. This would be front of 2. And the number in front of 2 is 1. That's why her entire name, Nina's last name, Ninomai, is just written as 1. I think that's another funny like play on words. That this singular character, the singular 1, is read out with so many characters. Ninomai. Just the number in front of 2. I think it is clever. I think it's pretty fascinating how like they can do puns like that and it works out. I remember I saw a clip of her talking with Pochi and I think Yofi, and they were just talking about a bunch of different examples of like Japanese name puns. And it was like interesting to see, but it was also like that kind of infuriated feeling you get when someone makes a good pun and you didn't want to hear it. But yeah, I think it's just Japanese names can be ridiculous, can be convoluted at times, but just learning the kanji here, I mean, take a look back at some of the other names that we talked about, like, we learned the vocabulary here, we learned what their Japanese readings are, and you'll start to see some common terms here. There are only a set amount of different naming kanji that people are supposed to be allowed to use in Japan from what I remember reading, though I do know that parents in more recent years have tried to get away with doing more ridiculous things for their when naming their children. I mean, I guess we're doing the same thing in this country as well, in the States. So, I mean, I think it might just be a generational kind of thing. But you can see like there's consistency here. You scroll down, like going back here, like just taking that consistent reading, we know that if you see this character here, it's going to be read as Ta. You see this name here, this character in the name, it's going to be read as Naka. Here we know this is going to be read as Mura. So we get names like Nakamura, Tanaka, Muranaka, Murata, and so on. And that's pretty much all I had to talk about. There is one last thing that I want to mention. I'd be remiss to do an entire lesson on names without talking about one of the most important names of them all. Wrong layer. So just one last name that I want to talk about. That name comes from a very famous story. I just want to say it because, you know, it's just funny to say it. Comes from a very interesting story that I would look into after this. And that name is a very famous child. A child blessed with a name of many fortunes and many wonders. We talked about some names here, how these names had to do with places, locations, circumstances, what your family did. But this child, his parents didn't know what to name him, so his parents went to a monk, and the monk gave them many names. So many names that they couldn't decide what name to pick out of all the names. So what they ended up doing is they had a wonderful baby boy named Jugimu Jugimu Goko no Surikire Kaijari no Suiyo Matsu, or Kaijari Suiyo no Suiyo Matsu Unrai Matsu Furai Matsu Kunneru Tokoro ni Sumu Tokoro ni Yabura Koji no Bura Koji Paipo 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 no Shurindan 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 no Gurindai Gurindai no Ponpokapi no Ponpokana no Chokyume no Chosuke. And that's an old Japanese tale of a family who couldn't come up with a name for their kid. I practiced that a lot, and it turns out that the moment I say it in front of everyone, I end up wiping out. But it's just the idea that these Japanese names can have a lot of meaning attached to them. We talked about surnames, which mainly talked about their location, where the people came from, what the people's occupations were. But you can see here that they wanted so many different names of positivity. Jugimo Jugimo being a long life. Goko no Surikire also representing a rock rubbing against another rock and how long it would take for those two to erode. Kaijari Suigyo no, meaning I think the number of gravel and pebbles in the water. And I didn't commit the rest of the story to memory, but essentially they were all names that had to do with eternal life. And when it comes to given names, usually there are actual meanings that you pretty much choose, kind of like how you choose like names like Hope or Grace or other names that have meanings. And that's another topic for another day. But I hope that for those of you who stopped by, for those of you who came in through the raid, for those of you who just stumbled upon here, I hope you maybe learned something, maybe you found something interesting here, maybe you just like to chill with the lesson. Either way. Yes, Siren? What's up? I'm waiting. Either way, I hope you had a great day. I had a lot of fun doing the research. Thank you for the cheer. And next week we'll get back into some more grammar lessons. I hope you had a great time. I had a great time talking with you guys, talking about this kind of stuff. I had a fun time researching this as well. I thought it was a pretty interesting topic. Oh! Thank you for the 10 gift subs, Reina. And I hope you guys all have a wonderful night. Enjoy the rest of your day. And class is dismissed. Now, I guess it's time for me to find someone else to raid. So let me do that real quick. Who could we drop a visit to on this wonderful night? Who's still raring to go? Let's see. I'm gonna go give our good old friend Roko a raid. So, if you're willing to stay, Let's raid. Rocco Roland. Have a great night, everybody. Class is dismissed.